In September 1944, the Dutch city of Arnhem became the focal point of one of World War II's most ambitious military operations, Operation Market Garden. The plan, devised by British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, aimed to seize key bridges over the rivers in the Netherlands, allowing Allied forces to sweep into Germany and end the war by Christmas. It was a bold, audacious move, but one that would end in failure and tragic loss. The Battle of Arnhem, the centerpiece of the operation, saw British and Polish paratroopers drop behind enemy lines in an attempt to capture the vital bridge over the Rhine River. What followed was a week of brutal fighting, as the lightly armed paratroopers found themselves trapped in a city swarming with German soldiers and tanks. Despite their bravery and determination, the Allied forces were overwhelmed, and the bridge at Arnhem, which became known as the Bridge Too Far, remained in German hands. Over 1,500 British soldiers were killed, and thousands more were captured or wounded. The battle left a deep scar on the city, and the memories of those who fought and died there continue to haunt the streets and ruins of Arnhem. In the years since the battle, locals and visitors alike have reported strange phenomena, ghostly apparitions of soldiers wandering the old battlegrounds, eerie whispers in the night, and the sound of gunfire echoing through the streets. The spirits of the men who fought in Operation Market Garden are said to linger, their restless souls unable to find peace. This is the story of the ghosts of Arnhem, where the past refuses to be forgotten, and where the echoes of war still resonate in the shadows of the city. The peaceful village of Oosterbeek, located just west of Arnhem, was once a serene Dutch countryside of forests and fields. But during Operation Market Garden in September 1944, it became one of the key landing zones for British paratroopers. The British 1st Airborne Division dropped into the area with the mission of securing bridges, particularly the vital Rhine River crossing at Arnhem. However, the operation, meant to end the war by Christmas, quickly turned into a nightmare. The paratroopers were dropped far behind enemy lines, with minimal intelligence about the strength of the German forces in the area. For days, the men fought desperately against overwhelming odds, and the quiet woods of Oosterbeek were transformed into a battlefield littered with fallen soldiers, both British and German. Hundreds of men were killed in the dense trees and the open fields as they tried to hold their positions, waiting for reinforcements that never arrived. As German forces encircled them, the woods became a deadly trap. Over the following decades, the bloodshed and tragedy that unfolded in Oosterbeek left an indelible mark on the land. Locals began reporting strange occurrences, whispers in the trees, shadowy figures moving silently through the forest, and eerie feelings of being watched. The dead, it seemed, had not yet left the battlefield. In the years after the war, the stories of ghostly soldiers haunting the Oosterbeek woods began to circulate among the locals. One of the first to report a direct encounter was Willem Bakker, a local farmer who lived near the forest. Willem had been a young boy during the battle and remembered hearing the thunder of artillery and the crack of gunfire echoing across the fields. After the fighting ended, he and other local children would find remnants of the battle helmets, bullet casings, and tattered uniforms scattered among the trees. But Willem's most chilling experience occurred many years later, in the early 1960s. One late September evening, after the anniversary of the battle, Willem set out to check on his cattle that grazed in a meadow near the edge of the woods. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees, and a cool autumn breeze rustled the leaves overhead. As Willem walked the familiar path, he began to notice something strange. The usual sounds of the forest were absent. The birds had fallen silent, and even the wind seemed to have stilled. A sense of unease crept over him, but Willem pressed on. He had nearly reached the meadow when he heard a faint rustling behind him. At first, he thought it was a deer or perhaps a fox, but the sound was too steady, too rhythmic. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slowly, Willem turned, his heart pounding in his chest. Standing a few yards away, just beyond the trees, was a figure. The man was dressed in the uniform of a British paratrooper, complete with the distinctive red beret, but something was terribly wrong. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, though open, seemed vacant and glassy. Bloodstains darkened his chest and arm, and his posture was stiff, as though he were barely able to stand. For a moment, Willem was frozen with fear. The figure did not move. Then, slowly, the soldier raised his hand in a weary salute. It was a gesture that felt both formal and deeply sorrowful, as if he were acknowledging Willem's presence before returning to his endless patrol. Without another sound, the soldier turned and disappeared into the woods, his form vanishing like smoke in the gathering darkness. Willem stood rooted to the spot, unable to comprehend what he had just witnessed. Shaken, he hurried back home, his mind racing. When he told his wife what had happened, she tried to reassure him that it must have been his imagination, perhaps a trick of the fading light or a lingering fear from the war years. But Willem knew what he had seen. The soldier was not alive. He was one of the many who had fallen during the battle, his spirit still trapped in the woods, endlessly searching for a way home. Willem's story, though whispered among close friends, was not unique. Over the years, other residents of Oosterbeek began to share their own eerie encounters. Some reported seeing shadowy figures moving through the mist at dawn or dusk, dressed in tattered British uniforms. Others spoke of hearing strange disembodied voices speaking in English, as if soldiers were still giving orders in the thick of battle. A few even claimed to have seen entire patrols of ghostly paratroopers marching through the woods, their movements silent and eerie. One night in 1971, a group of local teenagers, drawn by curiosity and the growing legend of the haunted woods, ventured into Oosterbeek Forest. They had heard the stories of ghostly soldiers and wanted to see for themselves if the rumors were true. As they walked deeper into the forest, laughing and joking to mask their nervousness, they soon found themselves lost in the maze of trees. As the night grew darker, the group began to feel a strange heaviness in the air. The once pleasant coolness of the autumn evening turned bitterly cold, and an unnatural silence fell over the forest. One of the teenagers, a boy named Martin, stopped abruptly. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. The others stopped and strained to listen. At first they heard nothing, but then the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed through the trees. They weren't the heavy, clumsy footsteps of an animal. These were human boots crunching on dead leaves. The sound grew louder, as if someone was approaching them from all directions. But no matter where they looked, the woods remained empty. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the distance. It was a man, dressed in a British paratrooper's uniform, walking slowly toward them. His head was bowed, his body hunched as though under the weight of an unseen burden. The group watched in stunned silence as the figure continued to approach, his form flickering in and out of view like a mirage. Panic set in, and without a word, the teenagers turned and fled the forest, not stopping until they had reached the safety of the village. When they looked back, the figure was gone. But the eerie sound of footsteps followed them for several more minutes before finally fading away. In the following days, the teenagers shared their story with the locals, who only confirmed what many had long believed: the woods of Oosterbeek were haunted by the spirits of the paratroopers who had died there. Their patrols, once meant to secure the area for their comrades, had become a never-ending march through the trees, replaying the final moments of their lives. By the mid-1980s, the ghost stories surrounding Oosterbeek had become well known among both locals and visitors. Some dismissed them as mere folklore, while others believed that the spirits of the British paratroopers still walked the woods, forever searching for reinforcements that never came. One such visitor, a British tourist named David Chandler, would soon have his own terrifying encounter with the phantom soldiers of Oosterbeek. David had always been fascinated by the events of World War II, and as an amateur historian, he had long dreamed of visiting the battlefields of Arnhem and Oosterbeek. In September 1985, just after the anniversary of the battle, David made the trip to the Netherlands. He spent several days exploring the area, visiting the Airborne Museum and walking the old battlegrounds where the British 1st Airborne Division had made its stand. On his final night in Oosterbeek, David decided to take one last walk through the woods near his hotel. The evening was cool and clear, with the moon casting a pale glow through the trees. As he walked along the path, the quiet of the forest seemed peaceful, a stark contrast to the horrors that had once unfolded there. But as David ventured deeper into the woods, a sense of unease began to settle over him. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to lengthen unnaturally. He felt as though he were being watched, though there was no one else around. Then, from somewhere deep within the forest, he heard the faint sound of footsteps, moving steadily toward him. David stopped, his heart racing. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the low murmur of voices. They were speaking in English, though the words were indistinct, lost in the rustling of the leaves. He turned in a slow circle, trying to see where the sounds were coming from, but the trees were thick and the shadows obscured his view. Then, from the mist, a group of figures emerged. They were dressed in British paratrooper uniforms, their faces pale and expressionless. They moved in perfect unison, their boots making no sound as they crossed the forest floor. The soldiers walked past David without acknowledging him, their eyes fixed straight ahead as though they were unaware of his presence. David stood frozen, watching in disbelief as the ghostly patrol passed by. The soldiers' movements were slow and deliberate, as if they were caught in a moment of time that had long since passed. Their uniforms were tattered, stained with dirt and blood, and their faces were gaunt, as though they had been walking for centuries. As the last soldier disappeared into the trees, the cold air lifted, and the forest was silent once more. David remained rooted to the spot, his mind struggling to process what he had just seen. He had come to Oosterbeek to honor the memory of the soldiers who had fought and died there, but now he realized that some of them had never truly left. Shaken, David hurried back to his hotel, unable to shake the feeling that the soldiers were still watching him, their spirits bound to the place where they had fallen. The next morning, as he prepared to leave, David spoke with one of the locals about his experience. The man nodded gravely and told him that he was not the first to encounter the ghostly patrols of Oosterbeek, nor would he be the last. The woods of Oosterbeek, once a peaceful haven, have become a place where the past and present collide. The spirits of the British paratroopers who died there remain bound to the land, their patrols continuing long after the battle has ended. For those who walk the woods today, the presence of the fallen soldiers can still be felt, a heavy, sorrowful energy that lingers in the air. Whether it's the faint sound of footsteps in the mist, the rustle of leaves with no visible source, or the sight of a lone soldier saluting before vanishing into the trees, the ghosts of Oosterbeek remind us that the horrors of war are not easily forgotten. The men who died during Operation Market Garden may never find peace, forever searching for the comrades and reinforcements that never arrived. For those who believe in the supernatural, the haunted woods of Oosterbeek offer a glimpse into a moment of history that refuses to be left behind, a place where the spirits of the fallen continue their endless patrol, marching through the trees in search of a home they will never reach. Story 2: The Ghosts of Arnhem Bridge. In September 1944, during Operation Market Garden, the city of Arnhem became a critical point of focus for the Allies. The Arnhem Bridge, which spanned the Rhine River, was a vital crossing for the Allied forces to secure in their efforts to advance into Germany. The 2nd Battalion, Parachute Regiment, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, was tasked with capturing and holding the bridge. However, as the operation unfolded, it became clear that the plan had underestimated the strength of the German forces in the area. For 4 days, Frost and his men fought desperately to hold the northern end of the bridge, battling against overwhelming odds. The narrow streets leading to the bridge became a deadly battleground, with German tanks and infantry launching relentless attacks. British paratroopers, outgunned and outnumbered, used the surrounding buildings as makeshift fortifications, turning houses and shops into strongholds. The fighting was fierce, and the streets of Arnhem echoed with the sounds of gunfire, explosions, and the cries of the wounded. Despite their heroic efforts, the paratroopers were eventually forced to surrender. The bridge remained in German hands, and the survivors were either killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. The defeat at Arnhem was a devastating blow to the Allied forces and left deep scars on the city and its people. In the years that followed, the bridge, later renamed the John Frost Bridge in honor of the British commander, became a symbol of courage and sacrifice. but it also became known as a place where the spirits of the men who fought and died in those brutal days still linger. Locals and visitors alike began to report strange and eerie phenomena around the bridge: disembodied voices, shadowy figures, and the ghostly presence of soldiers who had never left the battlefield. In the late 1940s, just a few years after the battle, the first reports of ghostly encounters near Arnhem Bridge began to emerge. One of the earliest and most well-documented sightings came from a Dutch police officer named Hendrik van der Meer, who patrolled the streets near the bridge during the post-war reconstruction of the city. One foggy autumn night, Hendrik was making his usual rounds near the bridge when he noticed something unusual. The air was thick with mist, obscuring much of the street, and as he approached the northern end of the bridge, he saw a figure standing near one of the support columns. At first, Hendrik thought it was just a late-night pedestrian, perhaps a worker heading home after a long shift. But as he drew closer, he realized there was something strange about the man. The figure was dressed in a military uniform, specifically a British paratrooper's uniform, complete with the distinctive red beret. The man stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the bridge, as if he were waiting for something. Hendrik called out to him, asking if he needed help, but the soldier did not respond. Instead, he simply stood there, staring into the distance. As Hendrik walked closer, the air around him grew cold, and a feeling of unease settled over him. He called out again, but this time, the figure turned to face him. Hendrik froze. The soldier's face was pale and gaunt, and his eyes, though open, seemed vacant, as if he were seeing something far beyond the present moment. There was a deep sadness in his expression, and his uniform was torn and blood-stained, as if he had just come from the battlefield. For a long moment, the two stood there, staring at each other through the fog. Then, without warning, the soldier raised his hand in a slow, deliberate salute. Before Hendrik could react, the figure turned and walked toward the bridge, his form fading into the mist until he disappeared completely. Shaken, Hendrik hurried back to the police station and reported the encounter to his colleagues. While some dismissed it as a trick of the fog or his imagination, others were more sympathetic. The area around the bridge, they said, had always felt strange. There was an eerie, oppressive atmosphere that seemed to hang over the streets, especially at night. Over the following years, more reports of ghostly sightings near the bridge would surface, many of them eerily similar to Hendrik's encounter. As the city of Arnhem began to rebuild after the war, the stories of the ghosts near the bridge became more frequent. Locals who lived in the houses and apartments near the river often reported strange occurrences: footsteps echoing in empty streets, doors opening and closing on their own, and the distant sound of gunfire in the dead of night. One such report came from Marie Jansen, a young woman who had grown up in Arnhem and had lived near the bridge her entire life. Marie's family had survived the war, though their home had been badly damaged during the fighting. After the war, they rebuilt and continued living in the house, but Marie always felt uneasy whenever she passed the bridge, especially after dark. In 1952, when she was in her early 20s, Marie experienced something that would stay with her for the rest of her life. One night, as she was lying in bed, she was awakened by the sound of voices coming from the street outside her window. At first, she thought it was just a group of people passing by, but as she listened more closely, she realized the voices were speaking English, not Dutch. They were low and hushed, as if the men were whispering to each other, but she couldn't make out what they were saying. Curious and a little unnerved, Marie got out of bed and went to the window. She looked out into the street but saw nothing, only the empty road, illuminated by the dim glow of the streetlights. The voices, however, continued. They seemed to be coming from just below her window, though there was no one in sight. Marie stood frozen, listening to the voices as they grew louder and more urgent. Then, suddenly, they stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, and a chill ran down her spine. For the rest of the night, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching her. In the weeks that followed, Marie continued to hear strange noises at night: footsteps, doors creaking, and the occasional whisper of English voices. Her family dismissed it as the house settling or the wind, but Marie knew better. She believed the spirits of the soldiers who had fought and died near the bridge were still there, trapped in the streets of Arnhem, reliving the battle over and over again. One of the most famous and unsettling ghost sightings at Arnhem Bridge occurred in 1964, when a Dutch historian named Carl Mulder visited the city to conduct research on the battle. Carl had spent years studying World War II and had written extensively about Operation Market Garden. He had heard the stories of the ghostly sightings near Arnhem Bridge, but as a man of reason and logic, he had always dismissed them as local folklore or the result of overactive imaginations. During his visit to Arnhem, Carl decided to walk the length of the bridge one evening, hoping to get a better sense of the layout and understand the strategic importance of the crossing. It was late September, and the air was cool and crisp. As he set out on his walk, the streets were quiet, with only a few pedestrians and cars passing by. The sun had just set, casting a golden glow over the city, and a light mist was beginning to rise from the river. As Carl approached the middle of the bridge, he suddenly felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The temperature seemed to drop, and the once gentle breeze turned bitterly cold. He stopped and looked around, but there was no one else on the bridge. The streetlights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the pavement. Then, from the corner of his eye, Carl saw something that made his blood run cold. Standing at the far end of the bridge was a man in a British paratrooper's uniform. The soldier was motionless, his figure barely visible through the mist. His face was pale and gaunt, and his eyes were fixed on the river below. For a moment, Carl thought he was seeing a reenactor, or perhaps someone dressed in costume for a historical event. But as he took a step closer, the figure seemed to shimmer, as if it weren't entirely solid. The air around him grew colder still, and Carl could hear the faint echo of distant gunfire, as if the battle were playing out once again. The soldier turned to face Carl, his expression filled with sorrow and exhaustion. Without saying a word, the man raised his hand in a slow, deliberate salute. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the soldier turned and walked toward the opposite end of the bridge, disappearing into the mist. Carl stood frozen, unable to comprehend what he had just witnessed. He had come to Arnhem to study the history of the battle, but now he realized that some of the soldiers who had fought and died here had never truly left. Shaken by the experience, Carl returned to his hotel and spent the rest of the night writing down every detail of the encounter. Though he had never believed in ghosts before, he was now certain that he had seen the spirit of one of the British paratroopers who had fought at Arnhem Bridge. The ghostly presence of the soldiers who fought and died at Arnhem Bridge continues to haunt the city to this day. Locals and visitors alike report strange and unexplained phenomena, footsteps echoing in empty streets, disembodied voices speaking in English, and the spectral figures of paratroopers standing guard over the bridge. For many, these sightings are a reminder of the courage and sacrifice of the men who fought during Operation Market Garden, and a haunting testament to the horrors of war. The spirits of Arnhem Bridge, it seems, are forever bound to the place where they made their final stand. Whether it's the ghost of a lone soldier standing in the fog, or the faint whispers of a long-lost patrol, the past continues to echo through the streets of Arnhem, reminding all who visit that the battle may be over, but the memories and the ghosts remain. Story 3. The Polish Spirits of Driel. During Operation Market Garden, the Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade, commanded by General Stanisław Sosabowski, played a pivotal role in attempting to rescue the British paratroopers trapped in Arnhem. The plan was to drop the Polish brigade near the village of Driel, located on the southern bank of the Rhine, and from there, they would cross the river to reinforce the embattled British forces at the Arnhem Bridge. However, the Polish paratroopers faced immense challenges from the moment they arrived. Bad weather had delayed their drop, and by the time they landed, the situation in Arnhem had deteriorated. German forces were entrenched around the city, and the Poles were cut off from the British forces on the northern bank. To make matters worse, the Rhine was swollen and treacherous, making a crossing under fire nearly impossible. Despite their courage and determination, the Polish soldiers were met with fierce resistance, and many of them were killed or wounded as they tried to hold the line against German counterattacks. For the people of Driel, the arrival of the Polish brigade was a brief but harrowing chapter in the larger battle. The village, once a quiet farming community, became a battlefield as the sounds of gunfire, explosions, and screams filled the air. The Polish soldiers, many of whom were killed before they could even attempt to cross the river, were buried in makeshift graves around the village. In the years after the war, Driel became a place of pilgrimage for the families of the fallen. But it also became known for something darker, a series of ghostly encounters that locals attributed to the spirits of the Polish soldiers who had died trying to complete their mission. One of the earliest and most chilling ghost stories from Driel came from Annelies Jansen, a Dutch woman who had lived in the village her entire life. During the war, Annelies had witnessed the arrival of the Polish paratroopers and had even helped to hide several wounded soldiers in her family's barn. After the war, she remained in Driel, but the memories of that terrible time never left her. In the early 1950s, Annelies had an experience that she would never forget. One late summer evening, she was walking along the banks of the Rhine, near the spot where the Polish soldiers had tried to cross the river. The sun was setting, and the river was calm, the water reflecting the golden hues of the sky. As she walked, Annelies felt a sudden chill in the air, despite the warmth of the evening. At first, she thought nothing of it, but as she continued along the riverbank, she heard something that made her stop in her tracks. It was a voice soft and distant, but unmistakable. The voice was speaking in Polish, calling out for help. Annelies, who had learned a few basic Polish phrases during the war, recognized the plea immediately. The voice was desperate, filled with fear and pain, as though the person calling out was in great distress. Annelies looked around, but there was no one else on the riverbank. The voice seemed to be coming from the water itself, as if someone were drowning in the Rhine. Heart-pounding, Annelies ran to the edge of the river, scanning the surface for any sign of a person. But the water was still and empty, with no sign of anyone struggling or calling out. The voice continued, growing louder and more frantic. It was a man's voice, pleading for someone to save him. But as Annelies stood there, staring at the river, she realized with a sickening certainty that there was no one there. The voice was not coming from the present. It was an echo of the past, the cry of a soldier who had drowned in the Rhine during the battle. Terrified, Annelies turned and ran back to the village, her heart racing. When she told her family what had happened, they were skeptical. Her father suggested that it was the wind, or perhaps a trick of the water. But Annelies knew what she had heard. The voice was real, and it had come from one of the Polish soldiers who had died trying to cross the river. In the years that followed, other villagers reported hearing the same eerie cries near the riverbank. Some claimed to hear entire conversations in Polish, as if soldiers were calling out to one another in the darkness, desperately trying to make it across the river. Others spoke of seeing shadowy figures moving along the river's edge, their forms barely visible in the mist that often settled over the water at dusk. As the stories of ghostly encounters in Driel grew, more and more people began to report seeing strange apparitions near the river, particularly at the spot where the Polish brigade had attempted to cross. Fishermen who worked along the Rhine at night often spoke of hearing the sound of oars splashing in the water, though no boats could be seen. On more than one occasion, they claimed to see ghostly figures in Polish uniforms standing on the riverbank, as if waiting for a boat to carry them across. One such account came from Jan de Vries, a fisherman who had lived in Driel his entire life. In the late 1950s, Jan was out on the river one foggy evening, setting his nets as he had done hundreds of times before. The air was thick with mist, and the only sound was the gentle lapping of the water against the side of his boat. As Jan worked, he suddenly heard the unmistakable sound of oars cutting through the water. He looked around, expecting to see another boat approaching, but the river was empty. The sound of the oars grew louder, and Jan could hear the faint murmur of voices, men speaking to each other in Polish, their words carried across the water by the mist. Jan stood frozen, listening to the eerie sounds. Then, out of the fog, he saw them. A small boat, barely visible in the mist, was making its way across the river. In the boat were several figures, soldiers dressed in the uniforms of the Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade. They sat in silence, their faces pale and expressionless, as if they were unaware of Jan's presence. The man at the oars rowed steadily, his movements slow and deliberate, as though he were caught in a moment of time that had long since passed. As the boat passed by, Jan noticed something strange. The figures in the boat did not make a sound. The oars moved through the water without a splash, and the boat left no wake behind it. The soldiers' faces were blank, their eyes fixed on the opposite shore, as if they were waiting for something, perhaps a battle that had already ended, or a crossing that had never been completed. Jan watched in stunned silence as the boat disappeared into the mist, leaving him alone on the river. When he returned to the village that night, he told his wife what he had seen, but she dismissed it as a trick of the fog or his tired mind. But Jan knew what he had witnessed was no illusion. The soldiers in the boat were ghosts, still trying to complete their mission, even in death. In the 1970s, the stories of ghostly Polish soldiers in Driel continued to grow, with more and more people reporting strange encounters near the river and in the village itself. One of the most unsettling encounters came from Jan Kowalski, the son of a Polish veteran who had fought in Operation Market Garden and had settled in the Netherlands after the war. Jan had grown up hearing stories of his father's time in the Polish Brigade, and as an adult, he became fascinated with the history of the battle. In 1974, Jan decided to visit Driel for the first time, wanting to see the place where his father's comrades had fought and died. He stayed at a small inn near the river, just a short walk from the spot where the Polish Brigade had attempted to cross. On his second night in Driel, Jan had an experience that would leave him questioning everything he thought he knew about the battle. Late in the evening, as he lay in bed, he was awakened by the sound of footsteps outside his room. At first, he thought it was just another guest at the inn, but as he listened more closely, he realized that the footsteps were heavy, like those of someone wearing boots. The footsteps stopped just outside his door, and for a moment there was silence. Then Jan heard voices low, murmured conversations in Polish. The voices were soft and indistinct, but they sounded urgent, as though the men were preparing for something important. Curious and a little unnerved, Jan got out of bed and opened the door. The hallway was empty, but the voices continued. They seemed to be coming from the courtyard below, so Jan made his way downstairs and stepped outside. What he saw made his blood run cold. In the dim light of the courtyard, a group of soldiers was gathered, their figures barely visible in the shadows. They were dressed in the uniforms of the Polish Brigade, their faces pale and drawn. They stood in a loose circle, talking quietly among themselves, as if they were preparing for a mission. The air was cold, and Jan could smell the faint scent of gunpowder, as though a battle had just taken place. Jan watched in stunned silence as the soldiers continued their conversation, unaware of his presence. Then, without warning, the men began to walk toward the river, their movements slow and deliberate. One by one, they disappeared into the mist, leaving Jan alone in the courtyard. Shaken, Jan returned to his room, unable to comprehend what he had just seen. The soldiers, he realized, were the spirits of the men who had died in Driel, still trying to cross the river and complete their mission. Their voices, their footsteps, and their ghostly forms were echoes of a battle that had never truly ended. The Polish spirits of Driel remain a haunting reminder of the sacrifices made during Operation Market Garden. The soldiers who died trying to cross the Rhine may never find peace, forever bound to the village where their mission ended in tragedy. For those who visit Driel today, the presence of the fallen soldiers can still be felt in the eerie cries that echo across the river, the ghostly figures that appear in the mist, and the cold, heavy air that lingers over the battlefield. Whether it's the sound of footsteps in the night, the splash of invisible oars in the water, or the sight of a phantom battalion marching toward the river, the spirits of the Polish Brigade remind us that the past is never truly gone. The men who fought and died in Driel continue their ghostly journey, searching for a victory that will never come and a crossing that will never be completed. Story 4. The Spirits of the St. Elizabeth Hospital. The St. Elizabeth Hospital in Arnhem, a once quiet and bustling medical facility, became a hellish epicenter during the height of the Battle of Arnhem in Operation Market Garden. From September 17 to 25, 1944, the hospital, located close to the Arnhem Bridge, was quickly transformed from a place of healing to a makeshift battlefield. As the battle raged around the city, the hospital's halls became overcrowded with wounded British, Polish, Dutch civilians, and even some German soldiers. The hospital staff, led by Dutch doctors and nurses, worked tirelessly to tend to the hundreds of wounded. However, the fighting crept closer, and the sounds of explosions, gunfire, and desperate screams echoed through the hospital's corridors day and night. Soon, it became impossible to ignore the encroaching violence. The hospital, initially a sanctuary, was eventually overrun by the Germans, and several areas were caught in the crossfire as tanks rolled by, artillery shells exploded nearby, and snipers picked off soldiers from windows. For the soldiers and civilians inside the hospital, it was a waking nightmare. Doctors performed surgeries as bullets ricocheted against the walls. Nurses worked under constant threat, tending to soldiers who cried out in pain, many of whom died before they could receive proper treatment. The morgue filled up quickly, and makeshift graves were dug outside the hospital for the dead. After the battle ended, the hospital, like much of Arnhem, was left in ruins. Over time, the hospital was rebuilt and normal operations resumed. But the bloodshed, death, and suffering that had once filled its halls left an imprint on the building that many believe remains to this day. Numerous reports of strange happenings, ghostly apparitions, and eerie sounds have come from the hospital, leading some to believe that the spirits of those who died there during the battle still linger, unable to find peace. One of the earliest and most unsettling stories from St. Elizabeth Hospital came in 1953, nearly a decade after the Battle of Arnhem. Geert Willems, a janitor who worked at the hospital, was one of the first to experience something he could not explain. Geert had grown up in Arnhem and had vivid memories of the battle. As a young boy, he had seen wounded soldiers being rushed into the hospital, many of them dying shortly after arrival. In the years following the war, the hospital underwent repairs and returned to its role as a functioning medical facility. However, certain sections of the building, especially the older, war-damaged wings, had an air of unease about them. Many staff members felt uncomfortable when walking through these areas alone, particularly at night. One evening, Geert was working late, cleaning the corridors near the old surgical wing, which had been heavily damaged during the battle and was now rarely used. As he swept the floor, the hospital was unusually quiet. The lights flickered overhead, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long. Suddenly, out of the corner of his eye, Geert noticed movement at the far end of the corridor. He looked up and saw a woman walking slowly down the hallway, her back to him. She was dressed in an old-fashioned nurse's uniform, the kind that hadn't been used since the war. Her movements were slow and deliberate, and as Geert watched, he realized something was wrong. Her feet made no sound on the floor, and her figure seemed almost translucent, as though she were made of mist. Startled, Geert called out to the woman, but she did not respond. She continued walking down the corridor, her form growing fainter as she neared the end of the hall. Geert rushed after her, determined to catch up, but when he turned the corner where she had gone, the hallway was empty. Confused and more than a little frightened, Geert retraced his steps. He had seen her, hadn't he? She couldn't have disappeared so quickly. Still shaken, he decided to speak to one of the older nurses the next morning. When he described what he had seen, the nurse nodded solemnly. "You're not the first to see her," she said quietly. "She was one of the nurses who worked here during the battle. She was killed by shrapnel while tending to a wounded soldier. Some say she's still here, walking the halls, making her final rounds." Geert was stunned. He hadn't known about the nurse's death, but he could feel the weight of her presence even now. From that day forward, he avoided the old surgical wing whenever possible, always wary of the ghostly nurse who continued her duties long after her life had ended. The hospital staff, patients, and visitors often reported strange occurrences in Ward 3, one of the oldest sections of the hospital, which had served as a makeshift intensive care unit during the battle. Ward 3 had seen some of the worst suffering during the fighting. British and Polish soldiers, many of them gravely wounded, were brought here in a last-ditch effort to save their lives. Most of them died within hours of arriving, their bodies piled up in the nearby morgue, which soon overflowed. In the years after the war, staff members began to notice strange phenomena in Ward 3, particularly at night. Nurses reported hearing voices low, guttural moans, and sometimes the faint sound of sobbing. These sounds would often start when the ward was empty or when a patient was sleeping, only to stop abruptly when someone entered the room. One nurse, Elsa van Hout, experienced something that still haunts her to this day. It was the winter of 1957, and Elsa was working the night shift in Ward 3. Only a few patients were admitted that night, and most were asleep by midnight. The ward was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of sheets or the soft beeping of medical equipment. At around 2 a.m., Elsa was making her rounds when she entered one of the patient rooms. The patient, an elderly man recovering from surgery, was fast asleep, but as she checked his vitals, Elsa noticed something strange. At the foot of the bed, there was a shadow, a tall figure standing silently, staring at the man. The figure was faint, barely more than an outline, but Elsa could see enough to recognize the uniform of a British paratrooper. Elsa froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It simply stood there, watching the patient, as though waiting for something. Elsa tried to speak, to call out, but no words came. She backed away slowly, her hands shaking. As she reached the door, the figure finally moved. It turned its head toward her, and for a brief moment, Elsa locked eyes with the ghostly soldier. His face was gaunt and pale, his eyes hollow, as though he had been dead for a long time. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the figure vanished, leaving Elsa standing alone in the room. Shaken, Elsa rushed to tell her supervisor, but when they returned to the room, there was no sign of the figure. The patient was still asleep, completely unaware of the ghostly presence that had been watching over him. Elsa later learned that the hospital had treated several British soldiers in that very room during the battle, many of whom had died from their wounds. She was convinced that the figure she had seen was the spirit of one of those soldiers, still haunting the place where he had taken his last breath. While most of the ghostly activity at St. Elizabeth Hospital was centered around the nurses, patients, and soldiers who had died during the battle, there were also stories of doctors who had never left the hospital, even in death. One such story involved the ghost of a British field surgeon who had been killed in the hospital during the fighting. In 1977, a Dutch surgeon named Dr. Emma van Dijk was working late at the hospital. It was well past midnight, and the hospital was quiet, with most of the patients asleep and only a skeleton crew of nurses on duty. Dr. Van Dijk had been reviewing patient charts in her office when she decided to take a quick walk through the corridors to clear her mind. As she walked through the empty halls, the sound of her footsteps echoing off the walls, she noticed something strange. At the end of the hallway, near one of the old surgical rooms that hadn't been used in years, there was a man standing in the doorway. He was dressed in a blood-stained surgical gown, his face pale and haggard. At first, Dr. Van Dijk thought he was one of the hospital's older doctors, perhaps confused or lost. But as she walked closer, she realized something was terribly wrong. The man's eyes were dark and hollow, and his skin had an unnatural grayish tint. Blood dripped from his hands, staining the floor beneath him. He seemed to be searching for something, his gaze darting around the room as though looking for a patient or an operating table. Dr. Van Dijk called out to the man, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked into the surgical room. Dr. Van Dijk rushed after him, but when she reached the doorway, the room was empty. The air inside was cold, and the faint scent of antiseptic and blood lingered in the air. There was no sign of the man, no footprints on the floor, no bloodstains where he had stood. Deeply shaken, Dr. Van Dijk later learned that a British field surgeon had been killed in that very room during the battle. He had been operating on a wounded soldier when a stray bullet from outside the hospital struck him in the head, killing him instantly. The operating room had been sealed off after the war and was rarely used, but it seemed that the surgeon's spirit remained, still trying to save the lives of the soldiers who had come through his operating table. Dr. Van Dyke never spoke of the incident publicly, but she confided in a few close colleagues, many of whom had their own stories of strange occurrences in the hospital. Some believed that the surgeon was still reliving his final moments, forever bound to the room where he had died. St. Elizabeth Hospital, once a place of healing, became a site of unimaginable horror during the Battle of Arnhem. The suffering, death, and trauma that filled its halls left an indelible mark on the building, and for those who work and visit the hospital today, the presence of the past can still be felt. From the ghostly nurse making her rounds to the spirits of wounded soldiers wandering the wards, the hospital remains a haunted reminder of the battle that once raged outside its doors. The stories of the ghostly surgeon, the wounded soldiers, and the nurse who never left serve as a poignant reminder of the horrors of war and the lives that were lost in the pursuit of victory. For many, the spirits of St. Elizabeth Hospital are not malevolent. They are simply lost souls, unable to move on from the trauma of their final moments. For those who believe in the supernatural, the hospital is a place where the past and present collide, where the echoes of war still resonate, and where the spirits of the dead walk alongside the living. The haunted legacy of St. Elizabeth Hospital ensures that the memories of the Battle of Arnhem and the sacrifices made within its walls will never be forgotten.